Okay, so good to have you guys back here. I'm so excited to follow those presentations. I can't imagine two better lead-ins to what I'm talking about than to have John talk about the nuts and bolts of improvisation, to let us know that we really all can do this, that we can start with very simple materials and turn them into great things. And then, of course, win in, getting us over those kind of mental barriers and also finding the ways that we can be inspired and then rewarded for our creative efforts. So I want to just step back a little bit and just talk about creative life in general. And I know we have lots of different people in this room. We've got kids that are just awesome performers. We've got moms and dads that have brought them here. We've got teachers that are with us, and we've got other people, grandparents. What I want to stress about my presentation is the fact that we all need to be striving for a creative life. If you're a musician, it's great. We've got, of course, a really obvious way to do that. But every one of us, regardless of what our interests are and where we're into, we should be thinking about ways that we're tapping into our creative mind. Just because there are so many important reasons why we should be doing this. And of course, now I've just lost my notes. Okay, here we go. So there's been a lot of research that's been done in this, and I've been getting really geeky about this because I want to kind of jumpstart my own creative thinking. I feel like all of us should be trying to build this muscle of creativity, and wherever we are, we can always be doing a little bit more. So I've been doing a lot of research about this. This fall, I'm going to be teaching a media composition class at the university, and my plan is to start with some real intense kind of creative modules for the students, because eventually they're going to be writing music for our local NPR station, some bumper music to get in. They're going to be writing some music for the pep band to play at basketball games. They're going to be doing all sorts of really interesting, creative, practical applications. But before we get into all that stuff, I think they really need to figure out how to get into some good creative habits, creative thinking. And I think we can all think about ways that we might be able to do that on a daily basis. Just some of the general research that has been done on creativity is we're, of course, finding out all sorts of health benefits. Whatever age you're at, we're finding that working in creative projects and activities have huge effects on things like our stress levels, anxiety, levels of depression, hormonal levels, all of this kind of stuff. The ways that we deal with trauma and stress can be hugely kind of buffed by the ways that we use creative activity. Creativity helps our learning and memorization. So for you kids, it's really important as you're learning stuff in school to think about unusual ways to put those kind of ideas together. And maybe if you're studying for a test, finding some really funny story that connects all of these random facts that you're trying to remember for a test could be a much better way to study for a test. For those of us that are getting older, what they found is that the brain kind of plateaus at about the mid-40s. But what doesn't is our efficiency in the brain. Our brain gets better at using higher logic and more efficient ways of getting information across. So creativity allows us, here's the myth that a lot of us hear, is that the whole right brain, left brain thing is a myth, really. Our brain is being activated in all different senses. When John is improvising on the scales that he's using, there's a left brain kind of analytical part that's saying, I'm going to be using this chord, I'm going to run into this key, like he was talking about. He's thinking about the materials, and yet a right brain way is getting to those materials in really unusual ways. Well, what we need to be working on as humans is really the neural pathways that connect our hemispheres. So we have these sides of our brains, but what some people don't develop very well is the ways that our left and right brain can interact with each other. So what we can do, whatever age we're at, is we can start to work on those pathways by doing really creative, interesting activities. And this is something that can continue all through our life. It's interesting that they say that there is no relationship between intelligence and creativity, which is great for someone dumb like me. So when you get up to about an IQ of about 115, 120, which is about average, then at that point, creativity and intelligence don't really relate much to each other. You can really do creative things regardless of how smart you feel at school or how good you are with quantum physics. It really doesn't matter. You really can be working on these creative skills. It helps your immune system, hormonal regulation, as I mentioned, and And what they found is that there's even different levels of creativity in creative projects. So performing someone else's work, for example, literature that Mozart wrote, stimulates creativity definitely on a high level, because we're thinking about interpretation and things like that. But as John mentioned earlier in his presentation, that being able to create more than you consume, in other words, if we're not just playing someone else's piece, but we're trying to take that piece and go into all sorts of different directions, now those neural pathways are on steroids. Now we're also all of a sudden doing these really interesting connections and building these pathways that will allow us to think more creatively in general. So why do we need to be creative people anyway? I mean, it seems like, you know, it's nice to have artists around, but boy, it's sure good that there are people that are engineers and people that are designers and doing all that other stuff. Well, of course, we need creativity in all aspects of our lives. And CEOs are starting to realize that. Colleges are starting to realize that. So there's been a lot of studies on the ways that universities, we've been really missing the boat on how we admit our best and most interesting students. It's not really those aptitude tests, the SAT, ACTs, that are going to necessarily result in the most interesting and successful students at college. Creativity is starting to become more and more important in college applications. So you're starting to see colleges with their application process ask questions like, if you won $10 million in the lottery, what would you do with it? Now you're going to get an interesting essay response, right, by asking a question like that. Oxford University just did an application where they just simply put one word. They put the word tolerance. Go. There's no leading questions. You've got to figure out how to do this. So for you kids, as you're starting to think, this is where the world is starting to go. CEOs are starting to ask questions about creativity in their interviews because they want the most interesting and outside the box, diverse thinking in their corporations. Colleges want those kind of students in the classrooms as well. So that's all great, except that we're getting smarter and less creative with every generation. You might remember 2 years ago, I gave a presentation on some results that have been happening with what's called the Torrance test. And the Torrance test has been given to hundreds of thousands of school-age kids, you guys' age, since the 1970s. And they give examples like the ones that you see on the very top of the little yellow flyer that you see. This is just one of the tests that they give, where they give a simple kind of random shape, and they ask the students to finish the drawing. So, of course, if you just do that first one on the left and turn it into a triangle and say that's a party hat, that might be the lower score than something really unusual and outside the box. So I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds is all. Most of you have pencils. Here's your 2 Torrance test questions, okay? I'd like you to finish the drawing, and I'm going to ask a couple of you to tell us what you came up with. And we'll see how crazy and creative you can be, okay? Yeah, anybody else need a porn sheet? Okay, you've got 30 seconds. Be creative.
I gave them my origin. So I got some extra pictures. You guys need anything, right? Yeah.
Who else needs a porn sheet? No one?
No, you can hang on. You go ahead and do it. Because you guys draw way better than I do.
Right. Yep, we're almost done. Yep, we're almost done. Go fast. And again, this is not an art aptitude, so we don't need to see, a masterpiece here, but we want to see what interesting variations we came up with. All right. Okay, I have to ask John. You know he's going to score high on the Torrance test, right? So tell us either one of these that you drew.
This one?
Yes, uh-huh. So can you describe it? Give us a show and tell.
Yeah, it's someone.
Oh, looking. I would give that a high score. There you go, right? Looking between the
Wow,
rows.
does that look like them?
That does, actually. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Looking through,
That's pretty good.
Wow.
He should have been an art professor. Who else has one that's really different? Okay, what did you do? So tell us what it is. He's got the shark, so he put a shark. He's got the little mouth, the teeth at the very end. That's very creative, all right? What about you? I know you're an artist.
All right, so what I did was, with the this one right here, I made a rabbit dog.
Nice.
With lightning strikes on it. The other one, I made a scolding dragon that has like water breathing abilities.
See, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about, right? So, as we're doing this, this is a skill that you can really come up with and play with. I'm going to give you a couple of creative starters, some other things that we'll do in a second. But let's talk for a second about why we think. Now, of course, we've got examples of just the opposite, some really creative thinkers in this room, right? But why would you say in general that you're starting to see creativity scores go down? I mean, we have access to so much cool stuff. Kids can just get to anything, anywhere they want. It seems like we should be, our creativity scores should be going through the roof, right? What we found with the scores is that they peak in about the late 1980s, early 1990s. And ever since about 1990, creativity scores on these Torrance tests have gone down with students. So, why do you think? Why are these kids getting smarter but less creative? Any hypotheses
Well,
on
just
that?
very basic. Everyone feels like they need to do everything correctly. Like everything has to be right.
Yeah, certainly. I think especially because we have access to so much information, this idea of kind of fuzzy middle ground maybe isn't valued as much. That's a great point. Electronics. Why do you think maybe electronics has something to do with creativity?
Because there's the electronics gets into your brain, and it's all you think about is you're going to rely on the electronics.
Yeah, you're just kind of consuming it. You're kind of passive, and you're letting it kind of entertain you without doing what many of us did as kids. I think if I had to sum up my childhood, I would basically, I think 3 B's. I think of bikes, books, and boredom. That was basically my childhood summed up that way. We had 4 channels on TV. Boy, TV got boring really quick. So at that point, you know, and the video games were pretty lame back then. So we had to figure out ways to go out and get into trouble in different ways, right? And make up our own fun.
I also think it's blue light too, because blue light can penetrate you through your eyes.
Yeah.
And the red stuff is good in your brain. If you see pictures of your brain from X-rays,
Yeah.
red stuff is good. And and if you have watched too much TV, your brain gets all fuzzy. And
We
the red
do,
stuff is
yeah.
creativity.
We do really build our brains, right? Our brains are plastic, and that's the thing that if you're feeling like I'm not a very creative person now, the cool thing about our brains is that we're able to mold and shape and change our brains, right? But we do have to stop with habits, like you're saying, like 6 straight hours of Minecraft or something like that, right? Some of that kind of stuff can really start to mold our brains in different ways, and we can start getting into habits. I know my attention span is much less that I can't even stand in line at the supermarket. If I'm standing in line like for 10 seconds, I'm like, you know, something might be happening on Twitter. I gotta be checking, you know. So I could tell that my brain, even in the last 10 or maybe 5 or 10 years, has started to be molded by electronics and technology. So I think you're right. I think we can develop these habits. One of the quotes that I put on here on the first page by Mildred Porphy Chase, I think this is really important, and you brought this up. The more technical our world becomes, the more essential it is that we see the whole of life as an art form, protecting the creative nature of mankind from an exclusively symbiotic existence with electronics. We're realizing that as humans, we're innately creative. And I think our bodies and brains have been molded that way because that's how you have to adapt to life. Life never quite happens how you think it is, and we, to be able to survive, we have to be able to think outside the box, think creatively. And so I think that's why a lot of our body functions tend to resonate toward creativity, and why it's very important that we keep this skill up. And I like this second quote too here by Bruce Taylor that you see halfway down. It says, "Few of us would disagree that students must be taught the necessary skills to function in an increasingly complex, conceptual and globalized 21st century society and economy. Students have to acquire so-called habits of mind that will enable them to develop the skills of creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving. In addition, they must be able to communicate effectively, collaborate with people different from themselves, exercise initiative, and be self-directed. Consider the list of skills cited above. Aren't these 21st century skills in reality arts skills? I think for all of us, we should be thinking about a way to survive this century is to be thinking creatively. All of these are things that we want, and I'm sure you kids, you're going to be very successful if you're able to do some of these things as well. So, let's take a little creative break, okay? So I've got an app on my phone that's called Inspire Me. And what this app does is it generates 3 words, okay? So I'm going to give you 3 words. For example, I've got right now, but we're not going to do this one. I'm going to pick 3 brand new ones. But I've got this one that says Florida, late, and wood. And I have to come up with a sentence that uses all 3. So maybe Florida would be really great to visit late in the summer. So that's what I would do. I have to use Florida, late, and wood in the sentence, okay? Let's see if you guys can take 3 words and randomly generate a little thing. You see where it says random word generator, okay? So here we go. Here are your 3 words, okay? Afternoon, value, correct. Okay, so find something really interesting to say that uses these 3 words. Afternoon, value, correct. I'll give you 15 seconds again. Afternoon, value, correct. Come up with a really interesting sentence. And they don't have to be in that order, of course, right? Afternoon, value, correct. Now we're using both sides of our brains, aren't we? We're using the kind of analytical, how does words function in a sentence, but creatively, how are they going to work together? Who's got a good sentence for me? Who can use all 3 of these? All right, all right.
I value correct notes way less in the late afternoon.
I like that. Yes, exactly. Right. I love it. Perfect. Win-Ann's got one, I'm sure.
Oh, gosh. This is a little boring here. This afternoon is the correct time to value the festival of the day.
I love it. Very cool. Yes, good. Anybody else have one in the back? Anybody have a good sentence?
All right, this afternoon, I found the value that naps are very important, and I think that's great.
Yes, exactly. We all love our afternoon naps, don't we? Yes. Very cool. Good for you. So, as we're thinking about how all of this happens, let's go back to what Win-Ann said about some of the monsters, some of the things that get in the way of our creativity. One of the ones I was going to raise my hand and say, my biggest monster is email, all right? So why would email be a monster for creativity, you say?
You could spend your whole
Interrupter.
day.
You can, yes, exactly. This is a part of the challenges that we have with technology today, is that we are so connected, or Facebook, or anything, whatever that technological monster is for you. Here's what the research says about distractions, okay? So this idea of multitasking is a myth. There's no such thing as multitasking. Our brain can rapidly go from one task to another, but there is always a degrade, our quality is always degrading when that's happening. So, and then research shows that. So even if you kids are studying for your homework, and you're checking your email, and you're texting someone, and you're studying for a test, what they find is that your short-term memory isn't affected as much, but your long-term memory is. That means that if you're studying for a test tomorrow, and you're doing a bunch of texting and looking at the book and kind of back and forth, then you're probably going to do worse on the test. They've found that distractions, I've seen studies that say everywhere from between 7 minutes and 20 minutes it takes us to go back into our regular routine. So imagine having our email on while we're practicing or while we're composing. And imagining kind of getting in that flow, and we're starting to figure out that fingering passage, and then we hear the little ding on our phone. We're like, oh, what's going on over there? The studies say to get back to that level we were at least 7 minutes. And then when we talk about creative flow, there's another term that talks about where we're in this mindset. Things are going really at a rapid pace. Our brain is working at hyper speed because all the neural connections are going. This is where you're so into something that you don't even realize the time's passed, right? That's called creative flow. That even takes longer to go back to that. So I would have you guys think about the science behind that, about the ways that distractions not only make it hard to get back into the flow of things, but our overall quality will go down as well. They gave some essay tests to some students, and they had a control group where they had the students and they just wrote their essays without any distractions. Other ones where about every 7 or 10 minutes there would be something. Someone would come in the room, or the fire alarm would go off, or something like that. They gave the students the same amount of time to finish the essays, and you can imagine the ones with all the distractions, even with the same amount of time, just weren't as good, right? Well, you can imagine that's how our practicing might be. That might be the way that our compositions might be, if we allow ourselves to be distracted. Now, these monsters are, they're very seductive in the way that they approach us, because there's something really great about responding to an email, right? You get that instant dopamine of like, I'm getting stuff done, and oh, that's shot off, and I don't have anything that I have to be talking to anybody about. I'm organized. But it's a short-term gain, right, and a long-term loss. So what I'd like to talk about, just briefly, we could spend a lot more time on this, but I'd like to talk about getting ourselves in creative habits, okay? So Twyla Tharp, on the back of the page that you see here, she has a quote that says, and she's a choreographer in New York, she says that destiny quite often is a determined parent. Mozart was hardly some naive prodigy who sat down at the keyboard and with God whispering in his ears, let music flow from his fingertips. It's a nice image for selling tickets to movies, but whether or not God has kissed your brow, you still have to work. Without learning and preparation, you won't know how to harness the power of that kiss. So, you know, you would think all of these great creative masters that we learn about in our music history classes, the Beethovens and the Mozarts and the Liszts and the Brahms, well, they must have had these just crazy random lives because they were just so creative. They must have just, you know, on the spur of the moment, just decided to go into a different country and explore and travel. No, actually what's really interesting about all of these composers is what Winana's already mentioned. They had specific routines that they went to every single day. You've heard a couple, right? We know about Beethoven's long walks where he would take a sketch pad with him. And in fact, these long walks tend to be a common theme with a lot of composers. They would take these the time to just clear your head and to move into a new room. The research shows that even by walking into a room from another room, all of a sudden your brain reboots and rewires. It's probably happened to a lot of you where you're like going to get something in that room, and once you walk in the room, you're like, what was I getting again? What just happened? That's the power of kind of clearing your mind and moving into a new space, and long walks can do that. Stravinsky would have a habit where he would, every morning without fail, he would play one of the fugues from the Well-Tempered Clavier. I'm not sure if that was kind of like just a little prayer to the gods of music to kind of get things going, or maybe to start that kind of analytical part of his brain going. But here's a quote by Mozart. When you think about Mozart, oh, he was just all over the place. I'm sure he was just so spontaneous. But he says, when I am, as it were, completely alone, here's what Winan was talking about, and of good cheer, say traveling in a carriage or walking after a good meal or at night when I can't sleep, it is then when my ideas flow best and most abundantly. And then my favorite, Brahms, right? You can imagine, Brahms and most of these composers composed in the morning. The only one I could really find that was like a nighttime composer was Aaron Copland, who said that his best ideas came at night. He says your most intimate conversations happen at night, so that's when I would compose. But most of these composers, like Brahms, he started his day off with coffee, and you know Brahms isn't going to have a cappuccino, right? It's going to be black, and he wanted his coffee black, and some sweet rolls, and he probably had a few more sweet rolls as his life went on, right? And then he would compose. He would start by doing some counterpoint. So when you play Brahms, one of the things I've noticed, I show students is, you think about Brahms with these beautiful melodies and harmonies, but there's all this really interesting counterpoint happening. Well, it's because he was doing a little counterpoint exercises before he started composing every morning. He would have his morning composition, and then he would take long walks around Vienna. We've seen this before, right? His favorite place to go was called Prater Park. It had a brand new Ferris wheel in there, and so he would just go with a sketch pad and walk to the park. And then he would have friends over, he'd have a big meal, and then a few more beers, and then some cards and cigars, and then he would usually go over to his favorite place called the Red Anteater, and he would just kind of go and most of his evening was kind of spent more socializing. So he was a morning composer like many of us. My point is we have to figure out what our body clocks and rhythms are all about. Are you a morning person? Are you an afternoon person? Like Win-En, I'm definitely a morning person, and my day is a long decrescendo, right? And so, I know that if I check my email at 8, I could go through 2 hours of email and waste all that great creative time in the morning, when I could do email at 6 at night. That doesn't take much brain power, and I could be much more efficient. So we need to be strategic.
3 minutes.
There are 2 books that I would recommend to all of you, and many of you probably are aware of these books. The first one is by Stephen Pressfield, which is called The War of Art, right? It's the play on the art of war that was the old Chinese military treatise, but he switches that around and calls it The War of Art. And he talks about developing these really interesting creative habits. The other one is now my brain just turned off. I told you, decrescendo. Oh, The Power of Habit. And The Power of Habit is a great book if you really want to think about how to get anything better as a habit in your life. He talks about setting up a cue. So this is something that reminds you to do something. Then he talks about a routine, and then a reward. So to develop a really good habit, whether you want to lose weight or whether you want to read 100 books this summer or something like that, every day you have to have a cue. Something has to remind you, and you do this already. If we brush our teeth before bed, it's just like, oh yeah, I gotta brush my teeth. Okay, the routine of brushing my teeth. Okay, what's my reward? A candy bar. No, actually, probably good. You feel breath or something, good breath, whatever it ends up being. So you need to figure out what that reward is going to be. Is it the double bar line as the reward? Or is it going to be, literally, if you want to go and give yourself a little treat after you've kind of gone through 30 minutes of composing?
Who's the author?
I'll have to look that up. The Power of Habit.
Charles D.
Thank you, yeah.
The Twilight Star book is very good.
I'm requiring that too, yeah. The
It's
Power,
very good.
Creative Habit is what it's called, and that's required of my college students. They're reading that for the fall. Anyway, we don't have time to go through all 10 of my little commandments here as far as creativity, but you can read those on your own time. I also want to pass this out. If my passer outer boys can help me, you guys can hand these out. These are some nice composition starters. So if you're kind of like, I'd like to compose, but I'm looking at this blank page and I don't know what to do with this, I'll have these guys, I don't know, Luke, can you pass these out to people? We could spend a lot of time on these. You can start with putting a bunch of black keys together, playing around with scales like John was showing you, and chords. There's some really fun chord progressions. You guys that might be aspiring songwriters playing around with that. Modeling after a piece, like Arthur was saying earlier. Taking a piece like this little minuet in G, changing a few notes and rhythms. Could you come up with your own version of that? We could even work from lyrics. I wish we had time. I know we can come up with some great jingles for the Festival for Creative Pianists on the very bottom of page 2. Think about the rhythms of that. But I want to finish by just, the other thing you can do is you can learn a creative partner. Somebody that you can kind of riff off of and get ideas from. So I thought we'd end with just John and me. We're going to take a key from anybody in the room, and we're going to have a musical conversation. We haven't worked this out. I have no idea where this is going to go.
G-sharp minor.
Oh my gosh. Get you back. All right.
So there.
Okay.
Well, he's been asking for challenging keys.
Bring it on. Okay.
G-sharp minor.
All right.
Or you can do my favorite key, funky. A flat minor.
That might help, yeah.
I could have done it in A flat, but
Yeah,
not G
might
sharp,
be-
but you guys are good.
Thinking outside the box.